second event of the EU Politics Symposium. Today we've got Richard Ashworth, an MEP for this region. And some of you might know Richard from last year when we did the field trip to Brussels, and Richard welcomed us to the European Parliament. He showed us the hemicycle, and it was a great experience of meeting real politicians and being there in Brussels. So Richard is member of the Conservatives and Reformists group in the European Parliament. Obviously, Richard is a member of the Conservative Party. And he's a member of a couple of European committees, European Parliament committees, such as the Committee on Budgets, Committee on Agriculture and Rural Development, and the Delegation for Relations with the countries of Southeast Asia. And I think Richard has been an MEP since 2004, is that correct? Okay, and today Richard is going to talk about, obviously, his role in the European Parliament, but in particular, he's going to try to cover the EU referendum debate, and as you can see from his title, the benefits of being part of Europe. So we look forward to your talk.
All right, well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. I recognise that this is after lunch, and I recognise this is the time you're normally having your siesta. So I shall get a little closer to you and keep speaking a little louder just to make sure we keep you awake. What I would like to do is talk you through the referendum debate, which is what I suspect you need to know about. But I have fond memories of some of your groups coming over to Brussels, and indeed one of them came over and liked it and decided to stay. And so she is now my PA in the Parliament and doing a fabulous job. So if she decides to move on, if anybody wants to take her place, please, I've great experience from this group and this university, and be very happy to take anybody on. So
yeah, so Claire did this module on EU politics and governance, and she also did the trip to Brussels, and then she decided to stay there, and Ashworth went to Richard.
So there we are.
That story.
Can't be that bad. Just very briefly to say that for 2004, when I was elected, actually, first part of my life is I've been a farmer. It's what I always wanted to do. I had my father and two brothers were farming in Kent, and at the time I left school, I felt that there was really no room for me back in the business, and so I took myself to New Zealand originally to farm. Chance brought me back 4 years later to the United Kingdom. Chance gave me an opportunity to rent a farm, which I took that opportunity and did that for 35 years, and probably 35 happiest years of my life. A wonderful place, wonderful way of life, a wonderful opportunity to bring up children there. But along the way, two things that interested me. One, education, so I became very involved indeed with education. Secondly, I started a company manufacturing dairy products. It started from fairly humble beginnings. Three of us started it, but it grew, and then it became a PLC, public company, became the biggest player in the field of manufacturing dairy-based food ingredients. It's still there, and I was chairman of that for 20 years. So that was the background, but by 2000, 2002, all avenues came to a close. My time in education was up, my time as chairman of the business was up, and somebody made us an offer we couldn't refuse for the business. So again, I talked earlier about fate and chance bringing you places. Fate and chance put me in the position I had the opportunity to be elected to the European Parliament. I've never regretted it. It's the most fascinating, stimulating job. I was very fortunate that when I first arrived, pretty soon after, there was an opportunity to take a seat on the Budget Committee, which, of course, as you'll probably appreciate, is one of the more senior committees of the Parliament. Incredible. I couldn't believe the responsibility which you had in such a short space of time. But I also say from then, and I still say today now, that back in England I could count probably on one hand or two hands the number of people who completely understand the job that I do and completely understand the relationship to the United Kingdom. And those dozen or so people will be in the Treasury. Because apart from that, my job, of course, therefore, is representing UK interest financially in the European Union. But outside of that, the perception and the portrayal of the job that I do in the media is way off the mark. The understanding of people who do it and the will to understand is very low indeed. So that's the only frustration that comes with the job. It almost makes MEPs what I call a Jekyll and a Hyde, because Monday to Friday you do one very, very technical job in Brussels or Strasbourg. When you come back at the weekend and you get involved in local politics, suddenly it's all about the bus service to this town, or schooling in that town, or the state of the infant school, or something like that. In other words, really nobody engages with you about the technicality of what you do. But that actually is always at the heart of things, that as a politician you always have to remember that politics is local. Local, local, local. People relate to potholes in their road. People would not relate if I was responsible for spending 150 billion euros a year. They wouldn't relate to that. But a pothole in the road, that irritates them. That's what they can home in on and understand. So that's just the background to all of that. Now, by the way, I've no intention of standing and talking at you for the next hour or whatever, so please make it interactive. Please, if there's issues which you are interested in, I'd be delighted to discuss. But I did think, to begin with, I'm just going to share a thought with you because it's a significant day. We've had local elections, results just coming through, and I'll give you my take on it. Very shortly, you've got a colleague, Catherine Bearder, coming in from the Liberal Democrats, and doubtless she'll give you her take, so I get in first. I can say what I think. Look, despite whatever is being said in the media, in my view, for David Cameron and my party, it's a good result. And it's a good result for two reasons. Firstly, it's an incumbent government. In fact, we've been in government now for 6 years. And it is quite normal at this stage, after 6 years in government, you would expect an opposition to begin to start chipping away, to start making major gains in local authority council seats. And my guess is, sticking finger in the wind, if the Labour Party were going to say that they would be a credible opposition for the next general election, the waymarker for them would or should be gaining about 400 council seats in this local election. So you'll see that by the time the dust has settled, they're way off that mark. It means for Labour, therefore, a lot more work to be done if they are to make themselves a credible opposition in the eyes of the British public by 2020. So they've got a lot of work to do. Also, however, for the Conservatives, I mentioned that it's a perfectly reasonable result. I think there's another reason which I'd say it's a good result that you don't hear about, is that if I look around the Western world right now, it's my view that most governments are under fire. And the reason is that there is what I call a sense of discontent, a sense of people getting frustrated or losing faith with governments in all countries. And when I try to think, well, why is that happening? And I think, well, firstly, I think it's a recession, 2007, 2008. And I think people find, even I find, difficult to understand, how is it that you have such a wealthy financial services system, has such a sophisticated banking sector, and yet, come the day, you found the whole house was built on sand and pretty well collapsed. And if it wasn't for taxpayers' money, it would have. It would have gone into complete or utter meltdown. So people, I think, are saying, how did government let that happen? There's a sense of disbelief. Second, I think that people look at Western governments and say, how is it that such powerful governments could appear to be forever in crisis with immigration, with refugee issues? Why are we always managing a crisis? Why aren't we in control of the situation with solutions? And people don't know that. Closer to home for me in Europe, I think the feeling is, well, how is it that the 28 member states allow the Eurozone and now the Schengen zone, allow those two very important constructs to get almost to the point of collapse before those 28 governments decide they have to take action and put in place new architecture, new structures? Because they have done with the euro. It's in a much, much sounder, stronger place than it was 3 or 4 years ago. It's a solid, sound economy now, but only because of the changed architecture. And so too with the Schengen zone. It had to be brought almost to collapse before the 28 prime ministers sitting in council said, this isn't good enough, we've got to do better. Well, people are saying, well, why does it have to be like that? And so I feel that there's that frustration in the population has given rise to what I call an anti-establishment movement or feeling. And that I find really interesting, because throughout my lifetime, and particularly when I was your age, anti-establishment movements were always the sole domain of the far left. What it really interests me today is that therefore I look around the Western world and look at the anti-establishment movements I see, they're on the right hand side of politics. And you see it everywhere, throughout Europe. Austria, with Haider. France, Marine Le Pen and Front National. Germany, Alternative für Deutschland. The USA, the Tea Party. And now, dare I say it, quite possibly Donald Trump. So it's extraordinary change which we've seen. Now, I started out saying this was a good deal for a good result for David Cameron, and why I'm saying this is that we largely haven't seen that right-wing anti-establishment movement here. In other words, that UKIP, much as it would love to say it has done, has not made the sweeping gains that Alternative for Deutschland or Marine Le Pen's National Front has. It hasn't made those sort of breakthroughs, and it hasn't got out of its core vote area. And the truth is, when the dust settles and my colleague Nigel Farage shuts up, he'll realise he's still only got one MP. He'll have a handful of members in the Welsh Assembly, which that's something of a contradiction, by the way. And then he will have a handful of councillors, but that's it. So there's no real breakthrough, no hands-on levers of power, for example. So what is happening? Well, I think there's something actually for David Cameron and the Conservatives, something rather more sinister and more dangerous than that. Because that right-wing anti-establishment movement actually, I think, is within the Conservative Party. And here's my point, that the Conservative Party always has been a coalition. The huge majority of the Conservative Party, particularly in the House of Commons, is what I call moderate, pragmatic, economic liberals in the centre ground, and a very much smaller, but usually more vocal, minority on the far right. So what I'm suggesting is that this EU referendum campaign and the whole question of Europe with the Conservative Party, it's not just about Europe. It is a fight for the soul of the Conservative Party. In other words, will the extremes take over the Conservative Party, or can the Cameron group of the party keep hold of the centre ground? Now, let me put my hand up and I say I'm one of those, what I term moderates. I want to put my hand up and say, actually, the British public out there, not not the cognoscenti, not the members of the Conservative Party, but the man on the Clapham omnibus, is extremely distrustful of extreme politics. They're actually highly unlikely to elect an extreme government. And whether it be the Labour Party with Jeremy Corbyn, if they swing too far to the left, or whether it be the Conservative Party with if we were to vote for a Brexit, and if we were to find that Cameron was ousted, so we were to find Conservative swing to the right, actually that would be the most astonishing turnabout in political events in United Kingdom, and we would be well and truly into uncharted territory. So, before I go on to European referendum, everybody happy with that so far? Yes? You agree? Yep, great. Well done. Let's get on to the... yes, please.
As a British farmer, what interactions do you have with common agriculture?
Obviously huge. Obviously because agriculture is the only policy which is 100% funded from Europe. All the rest are co-finance, which you will understand that's part funded by the member state, part funded by Brussels. And also obviously because over 80% of the regulation of agriculture comes from Brussels, because it is truly a single market. So yes, the relationship between farming and Brussels is huge. I would argue to farmers that this referendum campaign is extraordinarily important to them. I would argue firstly because of their funding, which comes from European Union, is, I would argue, greater than they would get from any British government of either colour. I would argue the reason for that is, firstly, in the European Parliament, I'm conscious on the Budget Committee I represent 500 million people, but I'm conscious that that means I represent 495 million consumers of food and 5 million producers of food. But those 495 million consumers of food, particularly in the big players like France and Germany, for historic and social reasons, many of them have a relationship with the supply side, with producers. And therefore, the political leverage is so much bigger in European agricultural circles than it would be, for example, the United Kingdom. So every time there is a crisis in the industry, back in Brussels we get sprayed with milk, and it all comes from usually Belgian, French or German farmers or Dutch farmers, never any British farmers. They're not militant, they just don't do it that way. But I say to British farmers, but you get the benefit of that. So it is important to agriculture that you know that they understand what goes on and recognise where that benefit comes from. When I talk about European Union and the referendum campaign, I've said earlier, and I say again, that I support remaining in, but it does not mean I support the status quo. I am somebody very much in favour of change in Europe. That's nothing new. Europe needs to go on changing, and maybe we can talk about that in one moment. Before I do, I just want to have I want to look backwards firstly, because I think it's important that we understand issues about Europe looking backwards, and then I'm going to come on to why that's important to you in your lives. Europe came about in consequence of 250 years warfare on the European continent, but more specifically, 2 catastrophic world wars. And let me suggest that your grandparents and great-grandparents addressed the problems of the generations who had fought those 2 world wars. So successful were they that I am of the generation who have lived through the longest period of peace and the greatest level of prosperity any European generation has ever lived through. The longest period of peace, the greatest level of prosperity. You should not take that for granted. We should also remember, I do, you won't, but in 1973, when we joined the then EEC, that the United Kingdom economy was the basket case of Europe. Today, because the European single market, we've combined 28 different national sets of rule books into one unified rule book. We've eliminated border tariffs, and with so doing, we've created a market of 500 million people in 28 different countries. Whatever you think of that single market, the facts are it is the largest market in the world by a long way. It is the wealthiest market in the world by a long way. Far bigger than China, bigger even than the United States of America. And that's important to this country. It's important because during that 40-year period we've been members of the European Union, we took that basket case economy and turned it around. And today, the United Kingdom economy is the 5th largest economy on earth. And you can say, was that because of the European Union single market, or was it in spite of the European Union single market? So I'm going to make this point here now. Historically, the case for being in Europe, for living in peace and creating wealth and prosperity is rock solid. You can't argue that it wasn't a great success story. But there is a problem, because whether you're wanting to vote in the European Union, whether you want to vote out the European Union, for better or worse, both sides of the argument will say that membership of the EU has been a big factor in everybody's lives. So, what I find amazing is that right now, when I talk to people out in the street, there's a big group who say they've made up their mind and they're in, a big group who said they've made up their mind and they're out, but you know what? There's an even bigger group in the middle who tell me, I don't know enough about it. And I find that strange. Both sides, love it or hate it, it's been a big factor in your lives for 40 years, and I don't know enough about it. So, who's responsible for that is an argument for another day, but I suspect schools, I suspect media have got a lot to answer for. But more than anybody else, it's the government. It's the government of all parties, and I think all three major parties going to have to put their hand up and say, yeah, for at least 20 years, we've not engaged with the people. I don't ever remember any leader of any party addressing the British public saying why we're members of the European Union, what are the benefits of the European Union, and why we recommend that we adopt those policies and stay where we are. What instead we've seen, therefore, is a 20-year vacuum of information, and that vacuum has been filled with some very loud voices from the far right. They've been filled with an awful lot of one-sided or misunderstood information to the point where I would say to you today, there is what I'm going to call a Daily Mail caricature of Europe, but because that's what people have been exposed to for a long, long time, that is accepted as right and the norm. Now, that's my view. I wouldn't use the words Daily Mail caricature outside this room, but that's how it seems to me. So when we come to this referendum, first thing I want you to remember that the referendum is not like a normal election. We've just had local authority elections. You elect a councillor, he's there for a term period, and if you don't like him, you can vote him out next time. This referendum is different. You can't change your mind because it is a once-in-a-lifetime decision. And here's the important point. It's not my lifetime. This is about your lifetime. So it's not about the issues which irritate us right now or the things we weren't happy with yesterday. I want you to start to think about your lifetime, the next 30, 40 years, and what does the world look like then? Well, let me suggest, nobody knows what the future holds, but I can suggest one or two or three, actually, things seem pretty clear to me. The world will change. It's pretty clear to me that economic power will continue to shift from the Western world to the Eastern world. So that traditional Western dominance of economic markets, of wealth and lifestyle, will be challenged like never before. And that's not because we've suddenly got bad at what we do here in the West, but it's because those emergent economies are catching up so very, very quickly indeed and closing that gap. It's not a question, therefore, of having to go out and beat everybody in the world, but it is a question that if you want to have the same lifestyle and standard of living that the previous generation had, if you want a successful government which gives education, health, welfare, pensions, you've got to keep your place in the world. And we're challenged. And that will be, I call it the elephant in the room. It'll be for all the things which catch your eye, actually that's the thing which will challenge your lifetimes most of all. And if we don't do something about that now, it'll be too late in years to come. So that's number one. Number two, I think, I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad tidings, but I think the world will be more violent. I think there will be more unrest in your lifetime than in mine. In my lifetime, violence and unrest was manageable because warfare was what we term symmetric. There were soldiers in uniforms one side of the line, soldiers in uniforms on another side of the line, and it was all rather predictable. And the structures which are put in place, NATO and things like that, kept that under control. Through your lifetime, that won't happen. There won't be lines of soldiers here, lines of soldiers there, wanting to fight that bit of ground or this. It's more asymmetric warfare. It is more about ideology and challenging societies. So I'm suggesting to you that will be worse, not better. And I'll give you two examples why. Firstly, because the Arab Spring did not turn into an Islamic summer of peace and prosperity. We now know quite the opposite. Russia hasn't turned into a peaceful neighbour. Actually, it's become an aggressive threat with echoes of 1939. 1939, I mean the rise of Nazi Germany, who invaded one country, nobody stopped them, invaded another one, nobody stopped them, so then they invaded Poland, and the rest is history. Why echoes of Nazi Germany from Russia? Well, because they've already invaded two countries and nobody stopped them. That's the danger we face today, and I think you should never underestimate that. And the third one, I think, is that widening gap between the world's rich nations and the world's poor nations. And when you put that widening gap together with the effect of climate change, it means economic mass migration will be a factor throughout your lifetimes. Already, we have more displaced persons and more refugees in the world today than we had at any stage during the Second World War, and that'll only get worse. And I'll give you the reason why. Because if you live in Ethiopia or Sudan, you're probably poor, you're probably hungry, you're probably living in violence and corruption. You've probably not had the greatest of educations, but you've had enough to know that if you've got one of these in your hand, you can see what you're enjoying in Southampton. And if I was living there and had one of these and knew what was going on, I'd say, why? You'd be an idiot to stay there, stay in Ethiopia or Sudan, for example. So that's why I'm telling you that it will be a greater issue. Migration isn't something you can just wish away and sort of stop tomorrow. It will be a great issue for your lifetimes. And it's important you understand these issues. They're going to be very different from the kind of issues which my generation have dealt with. My generation have dealt with things like common agricultural policy. Actually, it seems unbelievable now, but even when I started farming, it was never dreamt that Europe would be able to feed itself. It was always thought that it would always be dependent on food coming in from other parts of the world. So that's actually interesting, the turnaround we've seen, that we're not just feeding ourselves, we export food today. No, you will face a completely different set of challenges. But for your generation, therefore, when you come to confront those challenges, let me just suggest a couple of things. It seems obvious to me that 28 nations, all living close together, all sharing the same values, like democracy, rule of law, human rights, and free market economics, all sharing the same problems, all sharing the same aspirations, surely it's obvious that you'd want to work together intelligently to find intelligent solutions so that life would be that bit easier. History, throughout my lifetime and the lifetime before, history has taught us that retreating into isolation was never the answer. Go it alone was never the answer. But working together with others, we can be phenomenally successful. And let me talk about three of those areas which you need to think about. The environment. We Europeans are 500 million citizens. You go look at a map of the globe or a globe. We live shoulder to shoulder in one tiny, tiny part of this globe. Very small. A lot of people. And in that tiny patch, we all share the same wind. We share the same water. We share the same air. So, wouldn't it be obvious that you'd want to work to the same environmental standards as your neighbours? Wouldn't it be obvious that, like me, I live near the English Channel? What would be the point in Britain having the cleanest water going into the English Channel if just 20 miles away the French, the Belgians, the Dutch, the Germans all flow raw sewage into it, or if they flow chemical waste into it? It would be no point. And it's quite obvious, glaringly obvious, that we would all want to work to the same environmental standards. There's something a little bit more I'd like you to think about. This week, we marked the 30th anniversary of the disaster, the catastrophe at Chernobyl, nuclear power station. And that's a timely reminder to us, because in Europe today, we have 145 nuclear power stations. We know now what happens when one blows up, and that wasn't even within the European Union. There are 145 there, any one of which could go wrong. So wouldn't it be, I say wouldn't it be obvious we'd work to the same standards? No, wouldn't it be absolutely vital that you know that you're all working to the same common standards? It just makes common sense. Trade. I talked about trade earlier. Actually, that European single market, I said that it had been a great success for Britain. It takes now 45% of all the exports from this country. Absolutely dwarfs anybody else. The next largest export destination for us is the United States of America, which is 25%. So it's almost double what goes to the USA. And So often I hear from my colleagues, well, why don't we send product to the Commonwealth, for example? Actually, if you add up the exports going to India, China, and India, Australia, and New Zealand, put that all together, we export more to Ireland than we do to all those major Commonwealth countries put together. And for much that we hear the cost of it, the net cost of membership of the European Union to this country is £9 billion. So often you'll hear Nigel Farage tell you, oh, that's 350 million pounds a day. It is not. It is not. That's grossing up the figure. That's forgetting to tell you get back for agriculture, you get back for regional aid, you get back for the British rebate. It is actually 0.5% of the GNI of this country, or just under 1% of all the money the government will spend. So they go on endlessly about how many hospitals you can build and things like that. You couldn't. It is 1% of what the government spends. And that contribution to the British economy has been extraordinarily important. And the reason it's important is that today, we're not just fifth largest economy in the world, but we've got the fastest growth, the lowest level of unemployment, and the highest level of inward investment in all the European Union. And those who want us to leave the EU will tell us that, well, they want the free trade, but they're not prepared to accept the regulation. Fact is, if you enter into an agreement, if you want to get the benefit of it, you have to accept the rules. So when the out campaigns say to us that, well, they want the benefit of the single market, but because it gives away sovereignty, they're not prepared to abide by the rules, that's telling me you want to have your cake and eat it. You want the benefits, but you're not prepared to play by the rules. Let's be quite clear about this. I hear people getting very emotional about this sovereignty issue. If two of you enter into an agreement to run a business, you do it because you've got a perceived benefit. The two of you working together are better than one. But actually, of course, you've got to each relate to each other. So you can't quite go and do everything you wanted to do. No, because you've got to factor in what somebody else thinks. So imagine you've got 28 of you. And I said earlier that if you want the benefit of the single market, you scrub out 28 different national rule books for manufacturing and you replace by one. And that gives you access to a market of 500 million people, 28 different countries. That's the benefit. Do you get to make up the rules? Well, yes, in a way you do. In another way you don't. You don't sit and make up your own a widget. You want to manufacture a widget. Before we joined the European single market, that used to be manufactured to something called the British Standard. It was called a kite mark, and it used to have a recognisable mark which was manufactured to the British Standard. But all 28 different nations had different kite marks and manufactured a widget to a different standard, so I couldn't sell that widget in Spain because it didn't conform to their kite mark. So tell you what we've done, we've taken all that aside and put one definition of what a widget looks like, one definition of how it shall be, so I can take that and I can sell it to any one of those 500 million people without any interference from anybody. So here's the problem. We get emotional about saying, oh, well, we don't get to say what a widget looks like. No, but here's your problem. If you left the European Union and you still want the benefit of selling a widget there, you're not going to turn up and say, well, we don't conform to your rules anymore, we're doing ours. And they'll say, well, in that case, you don't get access to the market. Simple as that. It's sheer fantasy to say you're going to go away and you're going to rewrite your own rules. Fantasy. It's not being realistic about what happens with manufacturing. But there's a world of difference between sovereignty and power. They're not the same thing at all. When people say they're ceding sovereignty, fine. You are allowing other people, jointly with yourself, to determine environmental regulation. You're allowing other people, jointly with yourself, to develop widget manufacturing rules. That's obvious. So you are ceding a certain amount of sovereignty, but you're well aware of the benefit. And we in Britain, we've been doing that for a long time now. We've ceded sovereignty to NATO, to the World Bank, to the International Monetary Fund, to climate change agreements, to nuclear test ban treaties. There's something like 4,400 agreements we've entered into as a nation, all of which we reap benefit, all of which involves ceding a certain sovereignty. But here's the catch. Because if you do it, you leverage your position. When you lump together all that benefit, you are more powerful than if you don't. And I'm sure you're getting used to hearing this expression now, but there is one nation on earth who has complete sovereignty. They don't enter into agreements with anybody. It's called North Korea. The complete sovereignty, no power. And there are other nations who've done a phenomenal amount of agreements. United Kingdom, the USA. So, yes, they lose a lot of sovereignty, but who's the most powerful? So please be clear about that. I also want to talk about international trade, because I hear from the Out campaign, well, we just want free trade. We want to make up our own trading rules. Let me first go to a little trouble to explain to you the difference between free trade and comprehensive trade agreements. They are not the same thing. There are people I know out there saying, look, this is nonsense. We could go to Washington or anywhere else for that matter, have a cup of tea, shake hands and say we're doing a free trade deal and come back that day. In other words, what they're saying is we could mutually agree to reduce tariffs. That's going on anyway. That's going on through the World Trade Organization. But a comprehensive trade deal, for example, such as we have in the European Union, for example, such as we're debating and have discussed with Canada, or specifically with the United States of America, is something entirely different. When you get into those negotiations, let me give you the example of Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the so-called TTIP, with the United States of America. Let me just give you one example of why it's difficult and why it takes a long time. We've been now negotiating for over 5 years between Europe and Washington over the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. We're just entering, or about to enter, the 20th round of negotiations. Hopefully that's going to see us into the last lap, but we've left all the difficult, the hard-to-do bits till last. Let me give you just one to give you a flavour, but this is just one tiny example of so many which still are there to be resolved. Food. If you are a cheese manufacturer, you're a cheese manufacturer in Europe. So whether it's Stilton cheese or Parmesan cheese, all Europeans understand that that has what's called a GI, geographic indicator. So you here in England can't start making Parmesan cheese, but then people in Europe can't start making Stilton cheese. Okay? That's important. It's called GI. But here's the catch. In America, there are plenty of people making Parmesan cheese. So we're going to have a negotiation with them saying, look, it's now not possible for you to make Parmesan cheese. We may come to a form of words which is an agreement saying made to the Parmesan method or whatever, but we've also got to agree the labelling you put on the product when you go to sell it. And that agreement isn't just with Washington. We've got to make an agreement with 52 states in America. We've got to get them all to buy into it. And when we go to California and say, this is what the law on Parmesan cheese will say, no, we want an amendment. So, okay, we take the amendment back, the amendment goes back to Brussels, we agree a form of words, then guess what? We've got to agree it with 28 countries. So, can you please understand, Britain, not you, but when the President of the United States comes and says, a free trade agreement isn't going to happen anytime soon, damn right, it's taken us 5 years to get here with the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. You're just not going to get in the real world, people. You're not going to turn up to USA and say, hey, we want a free trade deal. Because all those tiny bits, Parmesan cheese, you're not going to get. Let me give you another one. I had representatives at 800 pubs came to see me. And they said, there's an issue here, because if you run a pub or an entertainment thing in European Union, there's something called performance rights. Does that mean if you play music, you play TV, you have to pay a substantial amount? You don't in America. Again, we've got to try and make some agreement, because if it's going to be a single market, a free trade area, it's got to be a level playing field. That's the kind of detail. And that's why Obama said it's not going to happen anytime soon. And when he said, you'll go to the back of the queue, well, look, there's 5 years and 20 rounds of negotiations to get to the point we are right now. Do you honestly think he's going to say to the United States of America, look, there's 460 million people in that agreement, which we've nearly completed, push it to one side, because there's 60 million Britons who want to jump the queue and get in front. He said you'll be at the back of the queue, and that's what he meant. Get realistic. All the comments that I've heard have been so frustrating because they're so badly informed. You understand what I'm saying here? It is an incredibly complicated deal. But it's not a free trade deal, this is a comprehensive trade deal. And here's my point, that's what you get with the European Union. You get all those issues about music in pubs, about who manufactures products. You get all that, and you actually get that for 0.5% of your GNI. That seems a pretty good and a pretty sensible deal to me. The other issue on bilateral trade deals is that I've been fortunate enough to be involved with 3 in my 12 years. First, I was involved with one in Norway where I wrote the agricultural sector of the agreement with Norway. Secondly, and more recently in the last 2 years, I've been involved with one with Vietnam and one with Singapore. The out campaign say we want to go off and negotiate our own UK-only trade deal. I can tell you that anecdotally, in no circumstance has any sector of the British economy, and I'm thinking especially here about the banking sector and particular interests we have, in no circumstance did anybody ever have to come and say, but we've been disadvantaged by that. But in every circumstance, absolutely every circumstance, the fact that we had the weight of 500 million people behind us, the fact that we were the biggest player on the field, meant we got what we wanted. And if I can quote to you that the Singapore trade minister had said to me, we had to close our eyes and swallow pretty hard to put up with that. But we're so much bigger than them, so we get what we want. That's the advantage of being big. Size matters in international trade. If you're talking to China, talking to the United States of America, it matters. I'm just going to say the last point I wanted to talk about was for the future, for your lifetimes. I talked about the single market, I talked about the benefits it brought. You need more than that. That's not enough. And it's a change that I passionately want to see. You need a single market in energy. You need a single market in services. And you need to develop a proper digital economy. We haven't joined it up yet. That is not a proper digital economy in Europe. Why not? Why not? There's no reason why you shouldn't have it. Well, I would say that the British deal which we have paves the way for all of that. And it is about reform. For your lifetime, what you actually most need and what people of my generation most give to you, quite apart from the peace and prosperity the previous generation gave to me, what I want for you is opportunity. You need opportunity. So to do that, we need to invest now, big time, in research and development to provide the industries for tomorrow. We need to invest big time in education. And actually, I've got the figures with me somewhere, but Southampton University actually does extraordinarily well out of funding from the European Union. Well, let me give you just an example, the Erasmus programme. You're all familiar with that, I hope. We should do so much more. It's your life ahead of you. You've got all those opportunities there. We should be making all that happen. But the key to the future success is that investment, and we need to be doing it now. So much more intelligent for 28 people to concentrate and focus their firepower and aim it at where they're going to get benefit, rather than 28 scattergun effect and all do their own thing. But here's the catch. Those who wish to leave the European Union will say, well, look, that's all very well. We do agree with the environment. We do agree about trade. We do all agree on all those issues. But we're going to negotiate a special kind of deal. We're strong, we're big, we're fifth largest economy on the earth. They need, quote, they need us more than we need them. Right, let's get a bit of reality going in this, could we? We do, it is true, we do run a trade deficit with Europe. But here's your problem. You run a trade deficit with Germany and Spain. With the rest you don't. And here's your problem. When we come to negotiate that special deal, firstly, on one side of the table will be one person, United Kingdom. On the other side of the table are 27 people. And they've all got to agree by unanimity. You've got to get all of them to agree, not just your friends in Germany who need us more than that. You've got to get everybody to agree by unanimity. And while we're about it, here's a problem. I said earlier, it's 45% of our trade is on the table. 8% of theirs is on the table. That's not they need us more than we need them. That's not them in a vulnerable position. But here's the final catch. They say that in that negotiation, in any special deal, the principles of the single market, the acquis communautaire, the freedom of movement of goods, services, capital, and people, is not negotiable. Not negotiable. So the people who have the nearest kind of deal, who are not members of the European Union, would, for example, be Norway. Actually, Norway pay 83% of the cost per person to be members that we do. Norway have no say in making up the regulations. I'm actually what's called a rapporteur, the guy who's writing the rules on part of the Common Agricultural Policy right now. Last week, I had a letter from the Norwegian Minister of Agriculture saying, this is our interest in this, could you please factor that into what you're writing for us? Well, that might work for Norway, but can you really see Britain having a right to some other MEPs saying, this is what we want written in that piece of legislation? That is madness, absolute madness. But here's the other point. All those people, be they Switzerland or Norway, who are not members of the European Union, have to conform to the principle of free movement of citizens. The Out campaign have insisted that they won't accept that. They won't accept there has to be free movement. But what they've never said is what, in that case, they would accept. They've never been able to paint a picture of what the outcome might look like, or more to the point, where the benefit would be. Would we be better off? Nobody has ever been able to say we would. There's a lot of emotional stuff out there saying, well, of course we would. Well, of course we're big. No one has ever said, here's the deal, this is what it looks like. And 2 points I would make. The only person, actually, who's ever said what it looks like was Michael Gove, spokesman for the Out campaign, who said, and I quote, we want to be like Albania. And if it wasn't so serious, you really would have to laugh. And what I did like was the next day, and you may have seen it, the Prime Minister of Albania wrote to the Times and said how very flattering. He said, actually, we want to be like you, but I can't imagine why on earth, great nation though Albania is, I cannot imagine on earth, why on earth one of the world's great nations want to be like Albania. And that advice has been given to the United Kingdom by NATO, by the G20, by the International Monetary Fund, by the CBI, by the Bank of England, by the Prime Ministers of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, China, this morning Japan, and of course the United States of America. And to all of them, Boris has said, stop scaremongering and interfering. So to him, I would say, well, okay, you've got a problem with those people who are speaking on my side, for my side, the In campaign. Guess who he's got speaking for his campaign? You got it, Putin. And Donald Trump, yes! You judge people by their people who are on their side, I guess. So, look, I'm going to rest my case there. The Prime Minister says, in his view, that Britain is safer, stronger, better off. But actually, it's your future, it's your decision. So on June the 23rd, you choose. Thank you. Yes, of course I will. Yeah. Because they can't all be in agreement.
I have a question. You said that.
Sorry?
I have a question. You said that you were in favour for obviously you represent also the agricultural side. How would the EU be impacted if the UK did leave the EU in terms of agriculture? Because farming in Britain, I imagine, I know that, like, for example, France is very big in the pharmaceutical section in the EU, but is Britain like one of the strongest agricultural sectors, countries in the EU? So how would the EU, like, sort of, would they be vulnerable though if the UK did leave in terms of agriculture?
Well, it's a good question, and in truth, no one knows. It's the honest answer, and that's why people like me will say, because you don't know that, it is a leap in the dark. You just don't know. That said, I would like, I'll make 2 points to you. Firstly, there are a group of people who want us to remain in European countries, and I'll explain why they do. What would be, in my opinion, the consequence of Britain leaving, and one of the reasons why they would want us to be there, and then if you want agriculture, we can talk about it in a moment. The East European nations, which are generally termed of as the new member states, the former communist states, are extremely concerned about Putin and Russia and his aggressive tendencies. They therefore see solidarity and unity with the European fellow states as being something incredibly important in practical terms, things like energy policy, for example, so that they're not completely dependent on Russia on energy. But they don't trust Hollande and Merkel on Russia. They trust the United Kingdom because we've such a long history and tradition of foreign affairs and overseas policy. Second group who support very strongly indeed are what I call the North Sea economy. The Dutch, the Danes, the Swedes, the Finns, the Germans, the Irish. They're all people who look at the world the way that the United Kingdom does, and they're all people who, like the United Kingdom, have fashioned themselves over thousands of years, and in so doing, they've become global traders, outward looking, with a global reach. And I say that because that's in marked contrast to the southern European countries, countries which are Catholic with a small c, but whose economic policy reverts to protectionism. Now, here's my first point, which leads into the next point here. Britain is, without a shadow of doubt, the standard bearer for free market economics, for anti-competitive legislation, for pro-consumer legislation. It is Britain actually who spearheaded the single market. It is Britain who is always the ones responsible for forcing open markets, forcing competitiveness. We understand that. The North Europeans understand that. And that group of people would be terrified that if the United Kingdom was not there, that free market entrepreneurial spirit would go, and the centre of gravity would without a doubt shift south towards the Mediterranean economy, and without doubt we would see a reversion to more protectionist policy. Two others who want us to remain. The first the Germans because they don't want to be left alone with the French, and the second is the French because they don't want to be left alone with the Germans. Then the second part I said I'd answer, really I've answered now, saying about the fact if we weren't there, Europe would revert to protectionist. And that, I think, is incredibly important because, of course, whether you're in it or not, they're our neighbours. They're not going to go away. They account for 50% of our trade. God willing, we still account for trade. But if they've become protectionist and you're stuck on the outside, that couldn't be good for us. One, because their economy, in my view, would not continue to expand. If anything, might contract. And two, because the volume of export we put to them would contract. So I think that's important. We are also very strong on what I call fiscal discipline. And I'm going to be a bit immodest here and say that that's the UK's influence on the Budget Committee of the European Union. You will remember a couple of years ago the agreement we made for the next 7-year, what we call multi-annual financial framework, that's a 7-year budget, which was reduced by 3.8%. First time that's ever happened in the European Union. Nobody talks about it, it's gone right off the radar, but you know what? 2 years later now, the consequences of that are really being felt. Because there's less money in the kitty, we've suddenly got massive spending demand, we've got spending demand because of jobs growth, because we've got 22 million people unemployed, massive spending demand because of Russian trade ban forcing a real crisis in agriculture, massive spending demand because of security, terrorism, etc., and massive spending demand because of refugee crisis. So suddenly money is incredibly tight. And there's a whole new language appeared. The budget commissioner we're working with right now, who's responsible for it, Mrs. Georgieva, her standard flagship policy, if you like, is called performance budgeting. To you or me, that means value for money. Now, Europe's never used this language before. And it's entirely the British, with their fiscal discipline, who have brought it there. So if we weren't there, the pressure from the rest to have a larger European budget would be immense. The idea that you're confronting a problem, you've got two choices. Do you say, I'm confronting a problem, I'm short of money, so I've got two things I'm spending on. Is this better than that? Would the world stop if I didn't spend on that? Actually, I've got to make tough choices. Or do I say, no, actually, I'll have a bigger budget and I'll carry on spending as I was? That's what would happen if the United Kingdom wasn't there. So we don't know apart from that. In terms of agriculture, it wouldn't make any difference. The European agricultural sector would continue as it is, but would the United Kingdom agricultural sector be supported as well as it is? I think it's doubtful. The National Farmers Union have just done a research project through a Dutch university who came back and said, without a doubt, Britain's farming would be worse off.
More questions? Yeah, Roger?
Thank you for your talk. I agree with much of what you said, and you talked about looking at the future, about how migration is probably going to be the new normal in the future, and I wonder how you see how the EU is going to prepare itself for that, seeing as it hasn't seemed to have done a terribly good job of managing the recent crisis.
Let me just firstly encourage you to split that up, because we get this very sloppy terminology when we talk about, I'm not getting at you, by the way, but terminology when we talk about migration, we bundle everything together. So let's split it out. First, we've got genuine refugees from war zones, people from Syria, people in the Ukraine, a tragedy happening in front of our eyes. That's one problem, which I'd love to talk about in a minute. Then we've got the guy from Ethiopia, Sudan, Pakistan, Afghanistan, who's got this and sees what you've got and says, I'm going there, regardless of the dangers, I'm going there. And then we've got European Union citizens exercising the right of free movement. Okay, so please look at them as three entirely separate issues. Then factor into another thing here, that the British population is living longer and breeding less. We've got now more over 60s in this country than under 16s. And so the impact as you roll that forwards in terms of the pressure on housing, healthcare, pensions is huge. when I start drawing pension, I want you to be working to pay for my pension. But guess what? There's less and less of you these days. And so if we don't, and the serious point is, you've got to start thinking about your future, because if you don't have, if you all keep getting older and you keep reading less, then sure as anything, the prospects are going to be less when you're my age, unless you import a workforce. And that's why the free movement of people is so important. Why is it a good deal for the importing free movement within the European Union? Well, in my opinion, because if you look at those 2.8 million people from the European Union who are working in the economy here right now, don't think about the stereotype of an uneducated, unemployable Romanian sitting on the streets. Think more about a French banker working in the city, an Italian designer working in the city, Lithuanian nurse working in the health service. In my own sphere, agriculture, we couldn't function without it. These people have made a monumental contribution to the economy, and when the dust of smoke clears from all the nonsense which gets talked about it, I think it's been an immense benefit, and it will continue to be a benefit. And in actual fact, I talked about opportunities. I want for you opportunities to be able to go and find jobs in those other 27 countries. Why shouldn't you? I want that kind of opportunity for you. So it's not just a one-way street. And then I'll talk about the other refugee elements, if I may, because, again, I see a lot of nonsense being talked about Syria. That people will say, you look at the few people in Syria and here that in Greece, which is a crisis. Please understand the scale of this. Turkey, I know there are some migrants, some refugees coming out. Turkey's got 2.8 million people living in camps there, and they're not squatting in tents and things. These are quite well organised camps. 2.8 million of them. Jordan, the King of Jordan came and spoke to us on the budget committee. He said, do you realise the population of my country has gone up by 40%? And the Lebanon has phenomenal numbers as well. So on the budget committee, what we've done, just before Christmas, we approved €3 billion to start to fund that. And we get attacked left, right and centre, and absolute nonsense being talked about it. Look, we are compassionate people. We've got a record in the United Kingdom of not turning the other way, not walking on the other side of the street when your neighbour's in a problem. So we just signed off another €3 billion. And far from being a slush fund to Turkey, actually that money is being given to those people in the camps for health and education. Because if we don't do that, there's a whole generation of kids who are not going to school. And that's one crisis now, but breeding another crisis when the war's over and they start to go back home. So you really got to start thinking constructively about it. And then the Schengen zone is another issue which we could go on about. So then to finish with economic migration, the guy with this in Pakistan or Afghanistan and fancies what we've got to control that. We've got to. Because open, kind, generous, compassionate that we are, there's a limit to what you can bring in. It's not even fair to those people who encourage them to think they can. So here's where we've got to start thinking long term. Haven't we, as wealthy people in this world, got to start looking at the countries they came from and say, look, you know, the sensible thing is here is development aid to help them improve their lives, help them improve their dignity from the country that they come from. How awful for any of you to say at the age of some of these young people do, I'm born and bred here, but I see no future in my country, I'm going somewhere. They don't want to do that. Human instinct isn't that. But I'd take the same decision if I was there. We're wealthy people. We're wealthy nations. Surely it makes sense to try to help. There's got to be carrot and stick. Major effort has got to be to improve their way of life, their ability to feed themselves, for example, in the country that they've come from, rather than stick, sort of putting up walls and keeping people out, because that's never the answer. It's a long answer. A good question, by the way, but it's a long answer. I apologise for that.
Wondering what you think of the EU UK deal in case that the UK remains
Yes, thank you. Good question. Because on the face of it, there were 4 issues which were discussed, and these are all quite obvious. The first was the democratic role, to make the European Union what we call more democratic. In other words, a greater role for the member state parliaments in the legislative process. Now, I think that's important, because if there's one place that the European Union has gone really badly wrong, it's those 500 million people don't have a feeling of ownership of the European Union. They don't feel that it's there working for them. They feel it's something which is done to them. So they almost feel victims of the European Union, rather than saying, it is here, it's on our side, and it's to provide us with, I'm saying, I'm passionate. I want it to give you opportunity. But actually, right now, you don't get that impression, do you, from the European Union? You don't think it's there to improve your life. You think it's a massive bureaucracy which has become self-serving. So that, I think, is why, if we could involve the member state governments more, people could begin to feel that it was more democratic than it appears to be right now. Then there was a question about the Eurozone. 19 member states in the Eurozone, 9 are not. Quite obviously, that would imply that the centre of gravity rests with those 19, if you're not careful, to the exclusion of the 9 who are not. But those 9 who are not second-class nations. They're not even two-speed nations. But they are nations who chose not to join the Eurozone for whatever reason. Now, it's important that there's a formal recognition from the others, from the 19, that those 9 have got rights. And so those 9 have a veto now, which can stop the 19 making up rules to the disadvantage. But more to the point, it actually gives the green light for go to those 19 to integrate more. And we think that's important. We think that if you're going to make the euro a strong currency, and it's vitally important to us, even though we're not in it, that it is, it's vitally important to us it's strong, and therefore to make it strong, they need one central bank, not 19 central banks. They need to harmonise tax policy. They need to converge social policy. So that was the second thing. The third thing is about call the ever closer union. That with that harmonisation, that convergence, there's always been a fear in British people that there's a country called Europe which is coming to suck you up and take you up and rub out your own identity and become a country called Europe. I've always I talked earlier about the caricature from the Daily Mail. It's a caricature because, believe you me, when you experience as I do going to the Parliament, I sit next to a guy who's a Bavarian and he turns up in his national dress. You know, the British think they're the only ones who want to be different. He's a Bavarian. And then I have people from Flanders, the Flemish, sitting next to the French who won't talk to each other because this idea that this country called Europe is coming to take you over is complete nonsense. But at least we now have it in writing. It's not there for the United Kingdom. But the biggie is the competitiveness issue. Nobody talks about it. Let me take you back through history. The 2 biggest developments, the most beneficial developments that ever happened to the European Union, first was 25 years ago, was the formation of the single market. Britain did that. Britain insisted the single market. 20 years ago, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, fall of the Berlin Wall, and collapse of communism. What were you going to do with those European countries which were unaligned to everybody? It was Britain made the rest see sense and have the enlargement policy. France and Germany didn't want to. It was Britain made that happen. So the last 2 big issues which changed the direction of Europe, yes, they came from Britain. So it's no surprise to me whatsoever now that I said earlier, I'm going to keep on saying it, the elephant in the room, the big issue will be that economic challenge throughout your lifetimes. And is Britain forcing that change? And so if we vote in, that's not the end of the story, it's actually the beginning of the story. It is Britain forcing that change. And other people recognise that. This is the important thing. The rest of the European Union recognise that it is Britain is what I call the grit in the oyster and makes that happen. And that's the real big sea change issue that Britain has gained from the EU. You happy with that?
Yeah.
Yeah? Great. Good? Yeah. Two. Shall I take the guy at the back first and I'll come back to you? Is that okay?
You said at the beginning that the euro is got stronger. Would you not say that given the current global economic climate, that the euro is still susceptible to the same threat towards the low rate?
No, I wouldn't. Let me explain why. It sounds a bit glib to say that we're British told you. Well, we don't use the expression "we told you so," but the idea that you could have 19 countries sharing in a monetary union and still keep 19 central banks and have 19 banking policies is obviously, to our view, obviously never going to work. And so that's why it's tempting to say, told you so. So all those 19 central banks have been removed and now there's one European central bank. It's also obvious that if you want a monetary union to work properly, you need to harmonise, I said, social policy. Let me explain what I mean. So you're going to have fiscal transfers. You're going to have money flowing from the richer areas to the poorer areas. Let me give you an example. The pound in Britain is a monetary union. Whether you live in Cornwall or in London or Southampton, you're in the pound zone. And here's what you expect. If Cornwall's economy is in trouble and central London isn't, money flows from one to the other. But you also expect that people in Cornwall pay the same tax rate as people in central London. People in Cornwall retire the same date as people in London. People in Cornwall have the same trade union legislation as they do. So when the cold wind blew, as I would call it, in 2008, firstly we found Germany, give you the analogy to central London where the money's generated. Greece, give you the analogy to Cornwall. I hope there's nobody from Cornwall here, by the way. Money flows. But the Germans started to say, well, this is crazy. We're all working to 67. Greeks retire at 55. You can't do that. And so that's why I've said you needed harmonisation, you needed tax rates. That's all been done, and I use the word the architecture of it is different today. That's why it's in a much stronger place. And for all that you beat it up endlessly, actually it's got growth of 1.2, 1.3%. Now, people mock that. They say, well, it's not like India with 8%. Yeah, but hang on a minute. Where are you coming from? If you're the wealthiest economy to begin with, just the plain mathematics of it is obvious, I would think. Great. Probably heard enough.
I think we've got time for one more question.
I'm sorry, yes, you had a...
Hi, thank you for the talk. It's really good. It's a question about TTIP. Basically, I've been reading in the media that it would prevent like nationalisation of like certain services in the UK. Do you think so? If I'm voting in 2020 for a Labour government and they want to nationalise trade, like say train services, that wouldn't be possible. And is that ceding too much power to the European Union in that sense?
Right. Be clear what TTIP would allow, and it's not a direct attack or forcing people to nationalise or not. What it would allow is open opportunities to procurement. In the public sector procurement, for example, you're obliged to give open opportunities. And so that in itself prevents, yes, nationalisation of issues. It doesn't mean you can't do that, but it does have some strict rules about state aid to industries. Now, let me give you an example of how that's worked in the European Union. State aid to airlines, for example. Some horrendous loss-making airlines, Air France, Sabina, the Belgian airline, Alitalia, losing shed-load of money, so therefore having money thrown at it by member state governments. That can't be good. And so I think the British can claim a certain amount of credit for this. We said, no, that's not lawful. And because of that, you've seen the rise of the EasyJets, the Ryanairs and things like that. And guess who's the winner? Customers and consumers, because they've got better range of choice, better range of qualities available to them, better range of pricing available to them. So that is what you get in a single market, and that's what you would be looking for in a trade deal TTIP, for example, if you're expanding your single market to a North American single market. Where I thought you might have been going with this one is there's a lot of mischievous talk to say that, well, it'll take over the health service. It'll allow American pharmaceutical giants to take over the health service. That is not true. Categorically not true. It is written out of it altogether, and both sides have said we have no interest in your health service and vice versa.
Okay, so once again, thank you, Richard, for joining us today. And
All right.
It's been a pleasure having you with us today.
Thank you.